Okay, thank you for that introduction, and I'd also like to thank Dr. Zaidi, Chief Electoral Commissioner of India, and his staff. I won't try to say their names. And I also want to thank CDAC for bringing me here and being so hospitable, looking after me here. I'll make one correction to what's been said so far. I'm not a professor. I think of myself as an election practitioner, a technician. Perhaps there's some confusion because I'm here on behalf of Professor Steve Snyder and Dr. Chris Culnane, who were from the University of Surrey in Great Britain and are now part of what we call COASCO. But I am the person who was the project lead for the development and deployment of vVote, which is an end-to-end verifiable system used in precincts and also used in remote supervised voting. So COASCO is a company, and its job is to promote, integrate and support the software, and all the software that was made for vVote is open source software, and it's freely available. So theoretically, anyone here in the audience could download it tomorrow morning and run an end-to-end verifiable election for up to 1 million people. Okay, perhaps you might need a bit of help from us, but the point is that it's an open system. I'd also like to say that vVote was actually not the first product to provide accessible, verifiable voting. We served a lot of blind people, but that honour goes to Professor Vora, because in 2013, one of her projects, Audiotegrity, provided this. But I'm very happy to come second after that team, because in fact, as you may have heard today, we share quite a few specialists, and I want to thank academics from England, America and other places who have contributed hundreds of hours to the Victorian Electoral Commission for nothing to help us get vVote right. All right, go. All right, so today I'm going to talk briefly about internet voting because I have quite a long experience, and it is the case that everything that Professor Vora said, all the risks that she pointed out are true. And I had to learn them all as a non-academic. And unfortunately, I had to learn some of those risks the hard way. Okay, so I'll talk a bit about that. But most of my presentation is a happy story. It's a happy story about our first deployment of a usable system around the world. Okay, I ran my first binding election on the internet in October 1998. In 1999, my company became part of KPMG, which is a big auditor, because they picked us up as an incubator. And in 2002, KPMG and Everyone Counts and Scytl actually bid for the American Secure Electronic Remote Voting Experiment, which was a $30 million US Pentagon-funded project to provide internet voting to military people. Now, interestingly, we didn't get it, but the project itself was cancelled because of concerns about security. Okay, so expensive project. Since then, Everyone Counts has provided hundreds of private elections and some public elections on the internet. And I finished there in 2008 after 10 years. It's interesting to say that internet voting is probably a good solution for about 99% of the world's elections, about 99%. Those elections being what I would call private elections. So my presentation today is a vote for supervised voting. The 1% of elections that are high stakes, public, critical, high risk elections, these I don't think should be run unsupervised. I worked at the Victorian Electoral Commission from 2009 to earlier this year. In this role, I learned firsthand the electoral body's concerns. So I had been a technician, and in the new role, I had learned what the Electoral Commission was worried about, and I also learnt what its capability was. Okay? It wasn't infinitely capable, it had limitations, and I learned those. It was a very good perspective to take to this field. I know most of the electoral authorities in the world are possibly not as well funded as the Victorian Electoral Commission, but interestingly in India, your Electoral Commission is more similar to ours, and you have the cooperation of CDAC, which is a highly capable organisation, certainly much more capable than my commission was, and I think you've got a very bright opportunity here. Before I go any further, I'm going to put up this table. Now, earlier today, these terms were explained, but I'm just going to quickly go through them again. I only see elections as being of two kinds. They are either supervised or they aren't. And of course, within those two kinds, you have remote elections and you have what I'm calling precinct elections. Now, it all seems pretty straightforward, except the words are very similar. I-voting and e-voting have very different meanings. E-voting is a supervised process on controlled equipment. I-voting, internet voting, is from home. But the kind of trouble you can get into by confusing these terms, I'll give you a good example. If you get a whole lot of common garden variety PCs with a standard browser on board, and you put them in an electoral commission, and running on those systems is a home internet voting application, and you're just making these machines available in the commission for people to come in and use, and perhaps there's some election staff present in the room, this does not constitute supervised voting. Simply because there actually isn't anything meaningful that the staff present can do or control or see. So my definition of supervision is that the staff who are there have a meaningful role and are likely to see trouble if trouble is present. Okay, so this is the first part of my presentation about my history in internet voting. I imagine that some electoral staff in this country are under pressure to provide what I've called remote internet voting. And what I want to add is I'm sure you already know about non-verifiable voting, which I provided at Everyone Counts till 2008 when I left. I made an internet voting system out of an internet survey system and a student exam application. To a software developer in 1998, internet voting looked pretty easy to build. Okay? It was pretty simple. Okay, you put a form out on the web and put the vote in the database. To many technical people today, including technical people and software developers at electoral commissions, internet voting still looks pretty easy. It looks easy. And if it's not thought of as being nice and easy, it's thought of as a solved problem, because e-banking has solved the problems of security. Okay, these things, I contend, are not true. Since 1998, the internet has become a rather unfriendly place, and all I want to say about security risks is that even supervised electronic voting on controlled hardware, so what I'm calling e-voting, even this cannot be secured. Okay, I've attended a few security conferences. I usually open with that line. I open with e-voting cannot be secured. So why push on? Okay, if e-voting can't be secured, internet voting is even harder again. And what I'd like to say about all the research that's taken place into e-voting is that we are unable to provide perfect defence, but we can provide perfect detection. So think of it as a kind of a tactical retreat. Okay? So everything that's been done has been about detection. Unfortunately, when I try and explain these things, I'm not always successful. And so the approach I took was a legal approach. So I'm now going to say a few things about the legality of what I call unsupervised internet voting. So some of those projects that have been mentioned, for example, the Democratic National Convention election of Barack Obama was run on a system that I wrote. The election of the Deputy Prime Minister of England was run on a system that I wrote. It's possible that some of these elections were actually illegal, or that they may have been very open to a legal challenge. I know of 2 electoral acts, one of them federal and one of them a state electoral act, that specify that all electronic elections should be executed with the electoral authority maintaining control of integrity at all times. So the definition of election integrity is a special meaning. It is simply that the election result is the total of the votes that people attempted to cast. That's what integrity means. And so the Victorian Electoral Act and the Federal Australian Electoral Act have a statement in there that says, all right, do e-voting. But if you're going to do e-voting, you must maintain control of integrity. To quote Vanessa Teague, who's an academic who made a huge contribution to e-vote, in an election you ask a question and you get an answer. Okay, you ask all the people voting a question and they give you an answer. And integrity is, did we record the answer correctly? That's what it means. So, integrity controls specified so vaguely in the Electoral Act are fine in the paper world because integrity is a concern of all staff in a paper election, and integrity can be enforced because it is only a simple matter of handling paper forms correctly. Okay? Something of a simplification. In the electronic domain, it is very, very difficult to even measure integrity of an e-voting system. For internet voting, it's not supervised. On people's phones and third-party devices, it's not possible to even measure integrity at all, since the equipment is being used that is not in the control of the electoral organisation. This would seem to open the organisation to legal trouble. This is my last slide about internet voting. Some of you are probably wondering why I use black slides with white writing and I mostly talk. I was taught to do this because the main people the Victorian Electoral Commission sought to provide services for initially were blind and low vision. And this is the standard that they use when they give presentations. Obviously, if you're blind, you can't see anything, but if you're low vision, you've got a better chance. It's a coincidence that just up the street from where I live in Melbourne, in Australia, it was the first place in the world where, in 1856, fully controlled, transparent paper elections were run. Okay? This was called the Australian ballot. They tried to do it in England 20 years before, but there was resistance, so they took it to the colonies. And they started the Australian ballot, also called the kangaroo ballot. And it's called the secret ballot. That's not true. Secret balloting had been in place in America 100 years prior. But what this system did is it introduced 4 innovations, all to do with election integrity. They were an electoral register for enforcing one man, one vote, and enforcing voter eligibility. Authority printed ballot papers. Okay, so the ballot papers were printed by the electoral authority and controlled by them and secured by them. This was new. A supervised collection and transport of votes, so security around the way ballot boxes were moved around. And of course, a private booth with a curtain where you could go in on your own and vote in private. Now, I just have a great joke I usually tell at this point, believe it or not. They tried to introduce this system in England, and there was a Protestant government in power. What do you think the Protestant government didn't like about the voting booth? Right? It looked like a Catholic confessional. And on that basis, they blocked it. Okay, and now to the happy story. I'm going to talk about the Victorian Electoral Commission deployment of an entire system that was built from scratch. Now, how is it that an electoral commission brought on software people, hardware people, experts, cryptography people, and actually built an end-to-end system? How on earth and why would they do such a thing? After making the internet system that I talked about, and after starting at the very beginning with something very simple that just put votes in a database, an expert or an activist pointed out to me that someone could access the database and change the votes. Okay? That's right. And that started a kind of a circular process where we'd fix something in the system, and then another expert would say, but look, you could break in like this. Okay? Now, 10 years later, the voting system was enormously complex. After all those improvements and all those changes, it ran on a hardware system with multiple levels of encryption and all sorts of bells and whistles. So what I would call conventional IT security had been applied to this system as much as possible. Okay, and these features, these security features, VPNs and whatever, these were touted as benefits of the system. However, in trying to mitigate all the identified risks, the system became so complex that fewer and fewer people understood how it worked. In the end, there was only one person who actually knew how it worked, and you can guess who that was, can't you? Okay, that was me. And when Beverly Harris, who's an American activist, about 10 years ago, pointed out publicly that all the trusted technical staff of Diebold are in the white pages, the phone book, their names, their home addresses, I started to become worried that I was putting myself at risk and putting my family at risk. Okay, I have a young family. The election system should never put people at risk like this. It should distribute the trust and distribute the risk, not concentrate it. And also, effectively, electoral commissions using this product were outsourcing the election. They were outsourcing it to me, okay? And I was responsible for the outcome. Okay, I started off with a very technical presentation for people here, and I furiously rewrote it last night. And I really wanted to talk about elliptic curve cryptography, which is one thing that vVote actually did do first, I hope. But I've made it much more comprehensible, I hope. Okay, the design of vVote. With all the experience I've had and with a whole lot of research to hand, I told the Victorian Electoral Commission to build its own system. In 2011, we engaged a researcher to look at remote unsupervised voting to see what the opportunities were, and unfortunately the results came back negative. And so vVote was born. I'm going to describe vVote as its features relate back to what I said about the Australian ballot protocol. So when anybody talks about a new fancy electronic system, what you really want to hear, I think, is you want to hear some of those 150-year-old features that have had 150 years of debugging, right? And so you actually want a system that obeys and behaves a bit like the paper system. Okay, and the first thing is that the way vVote works is it actually makes all the ballots. Now the ballots are electronic, they're not paper, they're electronic. And they involve cryptography. But this is all done months and months and months in advance of the election. And the ballots are made as blanks. The reason for this is that cryptography is a rather risky business. And so we want to do this in advance of the election so we can test the cryptography and audit it well before we start handing these ballots out. And in a minute I'll explain how it is that we make blank ballots and yet we give the electors ballots with candidate names. A second thing that vVote puts a lot of work into is dividing up these critical trusted tasks so that no single person or system ever has the ability on their own, or even in a small group, to do one of these trusted tasks. So before I talked about me being the only person who understood the whole thing, okay, that's not good. And so this time, we share out these trusted tasks in a meaningful manner. Another thing that's important is that we make everything to do with this system public. Everything. And that way, evidence the system has behaved itself and that election integrity is present can be seen by anybody. The final point I have at the bottom here, I'm going to introduce the term of software independence. I'm sure some of you probably know what it means. But it was a key goal in the design of the system, and I'll explain what it means and how it sort of changes our entire view of what voting software is meant to do. Okay. Professor Vora described earlier today that two other systems, Scantegrity and StarVote, are verifiable voting assents in the strict meaning of the word. It took me a long time to understand what that meant. I only understood what a verifiable voting system was by 2013, okay? Pretty slow. And it means the system is completely verifiable from one end to the other. Not an isolated part here, not two isolated parts that aren't connected, but really all the way from making the ballots to the votes coming out the end. That's what a verifiable system is. Now, there may be other systems in development, and there may be other contenders out there for a fully verifiable system. I only know of 3. And the way we do this is a bit different to Scantegrity and Starvote. I'm going to explain this diagram in a moment, but the main difference is all these schemes generally ask the elector to do something a little bit different. And we felt that that was risky because many of our electors were not able-bodied, they were blind or low vision, or didn't speak English. So we wanted a ceremony that could be intact, all right? So the way we perform, okay, let me back up a bit there. Scantegrity and Starvote ask the elector to do something at the end of the voting session. They ask the elector to optionally take part in an audit, and that's a kind of a trick to catch out a cheating system. The way this system works, it's called Preta-Vote. That challenge happens before the voting ceremony, where the elector picks the ballot that they're going to use. Okay, so to explain this diagram, starting on the left, you can see a little stack of blank ballots. So I hope you can read there that in the leftmost stack, they're just lines. They don't have names on them. The next column is the ballots being voted. Now, what you'll notice is that the candidate names are different. They're not different, they're just in a different order on each ballot. So it's Carla, Alex, Bob, Donna. The legal order in this particular example is actually Alex, Bob, Carla, Donna. And the way Preta-Vote works is it performs this little trick where every elector gets a ballot that has a different order on it. Okay? They vote the same way. Here I'm referring to the American system where you just make 1 mark. In Australia it's a preferential, but still works. The ballots are torn in half. Okay? Torn in half. The names part, the shuffled ordered names, is destroyed, shredded. And if you look there at the second last column, that just leaves behind a little stack of just the marks. And of course, if I showed you that stack there, you'd have no idea what those votes were for, because the names in each case have been different, the order, and you don't know what that X on the top there is against, okay, whether it's Carla or Alex or whomever. And the way Preta-Vote works is it retains a code on each one of these little marks-only slips we call receipts, and that code helps the Commission reorder and reapply the names in the rightmost column at the end of the election. So that's how our scheme works. We were worried also because we wanted a system in Australia where the verification system wasn't going to be harder for people who chose to vote in a more enfranchised way. When you vote in Australia, you've got some choices. You can either do the quick way, which is you just pick a party, or you can vote the slow way when you actually number the candidates that are available. We didn't want the verification system to be onerous and cause people to do stuff the quick way. We wanted them to do it the way they wanted. We looked at lots of different protocols. We looked at Scantegrity, VoteBox, Helios, Wombat, and Civitas, and we chose Preta-Vote. The step now, I'll explain step by step. I won't give a lot of detail in these steps, but I'll just tell you how they work. So the first step is for us to make the e-ballots before the election. So the Electoral Authority makes a finite set of ballots. It's not possible for the election system to somehow come up with another 1 million votes. Okay, if we generate 1 million ballots, this system's going to take 1 million votes. Okay, if 1,000,005 votes turn up, something's wrong. So we're back to that old-fashioned idea where the Electoral Commission creates and authorises the ballots. It's important too, because each of these ballots that we make has this code on it, and that's meant to be a secret. So we generate these in advance and we test that. There's an entire scientific paper about this technique available from the JETS conference, and I'll give a list of references at the end of my presentation. The second thing we do is we share out the trust in the way the system works. So rather than concentrating trust in a very small group of geeks like me, or in one critical machine, And if you use one critical machine to make all the keys and then you hand the keys out, that machine had all the keys in one place at once at one time. It's bad. The way we do this is that we use elliptic curve cryptography. Now, I can't explain it this time, I won't have time, but it's a fairly new technique which allows complete distribution of key generation and secret signing. Okay, that's why we chose that approach. And that allows us to fully distribute the receipt of when the votes come into our central system. A whole lot of separate machines each sign that vote. At the end of the election, we also share out the business of doing decryption, and we share out the business of doing shuffling. These critical tasks that need to be done properly. We go an awful long way to make all information public. So one of the components of the system is called the bulletin board, and you can think of it as like a public bulletin board in a town, except that all the information put on there can't be erased or changed. So whatever I put up there, it's there for good and it can't be changed in a provable manner. And that includes all the configuration for the system, all the candidates that went in, all the source codes, okay, the officiated source codes used in the election, all the transactions, and then when we're done with our process, we put all the votes up there as well. In a more conventional electronic voting deployment, if there's some kind of challenge or problem, generally what happens is that system log files are retrieved and they're brought out and they might be presented to a court. The problem is that these log files generally capture sensitive information because they're technical logs, or they are incomprehensible because they're programmer speak. These daily transactions I'm calling here are really the same thing, but they have been designed so that all this stuff can be made public without any risk to the election or any risk to voters or their votes. This is one of the harder steps in the design. It's what Professor Vora called a tally proof. We too have to do this, and it's actually harder for us than it is for Scantegrity. The reason is that Scantegrity is what's known as an homomorphic addition system. Votes don't actually need to be decrypted to add them up. We don't have that luxury because we're collecting proportional representation ballots with lots of numbers. Okay? We cannot add those up homomorphically, so we have to shuffle them and decryption. All right. And you know, most of these steps really do echo the paper process. This is not an alien proposition, really, I don't think. Provide decryption in a way it's not just a black box, so that when you do have scrutineers coming to look, they actually have something to look at, so they can be vigilant. All right, so I've said that I don't like big complicated systems, and although vVote already probably sounds pretty complicated to you, it actually is pretty simple. Here comes an enormous complicated diagram. Right, now it may look complicated, but in fact, that's an arrangement of machines to collect 1 million votes. And each one of these groups here is really just one service. And there's actually only 3 services in the entire system. And the messages exchanged between them, there might be 3 or 4 messages. That's all. Okay, I'm going to turn to verification. This is a big slide. Really, it's just a laundry list. I don't expect you to read this slide, but
Do you want me to continue without the mics, or shall I wait?
So this is just a laundry list. In fact, vVote provides 10 different things that you can look at. Uh-oh, I know. And just about all of them can be seen by everybody. So we don't need to sign up experts, we don't need NDAs, just let them in. There's a couple of things that can't be seen by everybody, and they're only to be seen by electors at the polling place, and I'll show you a video in a minute, you'll get an idea of what that is. Now, I just want to draw your attention to the bottom one. It says that hashes of commitments are published in the newspaper each day, okay? You might wonder what the hell that is. When we work in the electronic domain, basically all the information is soft. So we need to do something which is a bit like a kind of an anchor into the real world, which locks everything we've collected. So every day we put out one of these things. And the newspaper people really didn't get this, okay? They really didn't. But that big number there that's coloured in yellow is an MD5 hash of the day's e-voting transcripts. So that locks it down. So if someone breaks into our system and attempts to change absolutely everything, all the way from top to bottom, they're caught out by this, because this newspaper, the Herald Sun, distributed widely. It's available in paper form. It's not an e-newspaper. And I'll tell you that it was about $30 or $40 to put this advertisement in every day. It would have been cheaper if I could have made it a personal. And I thought to myself, now how could I do that? I could have, you want a good time? Ring this phone number, 189AA953FA41BC 466064C8. Make it look like a personal ad. It would have been cheaper, but I didn't. Now I'm going to talk about more details of the actual deployment. So the VVote ran from the 7th of November to the 29th of November. It was available 2 weeks before the election in what we call the early voting period. Ballot generation, as I explained it before, had already taken place in October. There were 24 locations in Victoria provided for this deployment, and the Victorian locations were only for people with special needs. They were only for people who had low vision, blindness, motor problems, or who couldn't read English. Okay, so the law constrained us, and you couldn't use this on election day. However, there was also a site in London, and this site in London took the lion's share of all our votes. This was available to any Australians, any Victorians who were in London during the election in this early voting period. The whole thing was done using cheap tablet computers, Android Nexus 10 computers, and supermarket receipt printers. Okay, so everything was cheap and cheerful. And the VEC website provided all this important information as its bulletin board. And all the VEC people who supported VVote were specially trained for about a day a person. So we brought them all in, and they had about one contact day of training. But it was brought up, it's been brought up before, actually this is a very critical element. And I'll talk a bit later about capability in election provision, and this is really where the rubber meets the road. Cryptography stuff is hard, but the actual sales staff, if you like, if they're frightened, or they don't like it, or they don't get it, people aren't going to use it. Okay, so I've got a 10-minute video, and just wait a minute before you start. I just want to give you a disclaimer. I shot this video myself, and so I'm holding the camera. Okay, now it's nice and steady, and it's pretty good, and it's me talking. But at the end, I struggle a bit with the receipt because I've only got one free hand, but you'll hear me complain about that. But most people voting would have two hands, I hope. The 2014 state election in Victoria, Australia. It's a new system, and it has an unusual quality, and that is that it is verifiable. However, to the staff and to the voters themselves, there aren't great changes between this system and a system that preceded it in 2010 for e-voting. Now, what you see in the video here is actually the staff terminal, so there's really two parts to the system. There's always at least one staff terminal, there may be more than one. And there's also a voting machine which the elector interacts with. And there may be several of these in a large polling station for one staff terminal. The staff terminal is called the VPS, which stands for the VVote Printing System. It consists of an Android tablet and a small receipt-type printer, such as you would see in a shopping centre. It sits on a cardboard booth with a mounted camera and a scanning area to the right. And this is used for the occasional task as requested by an elector or as required by a staff member where audits take place. So we'll introduce the concept of verification audits, or where a vote doesn't go very well and in fact the staff member has the ability to cancel the vote and issue another or issue a paper vote. So when an elector arrives at a polling station, they are brought over to this system. And really the basic information we need to know from the elector is the district that he or she is enrolled in. And that's the first choice here. As you can see, there's quite a few districts. There's 88. In this case, we're just chosen Albert Park. In Victoria, electors have access to this system because legislation has provided the system for people with vision impairment, but also other barriers to voting without assistance. So it's really an assistive voting system in Victoria for people who just can't interact with English ballot papers on their own. And so here you see some options in terms of the screen. There's actually 3 different interfaces. The system offers a visual guidance interface where you have to find and touch things, an audio guidance interface where you stroke the screen any way you like, and finally an audio guidance system within a latex keypad which behaves a bit like a phone keypad. A bit further down I can pick the font size, so if we're using a visual mode I can pick one of 2 font sizes. Again, for people with low vision, sometimes it's easier for them to see if we reverse the contrast from black on white to white on black. And finally, if I am a non-English speaker, the system's providing 20 languages, and these are the top 20 languages according to the census of Victorian adults. The default is English, but it does provide right to left languages and other more unusual languages. Okay, so having arrived here, I'll say that I'm an Albert Park elector. The staff member presses the print button. A request is made to the central server for the system to effectively print a ballot, so that's what it's doing. And so over here, out of this printer, comes the ballot. Now, it's not an ordinary ballot. It's actually quite long, and it's a ballot that consists of all the candidate names. Okay, so the first person you can see here, it's not terribly clear, but the first person is called Martin Foley, the Australian Labor Party. This is a test system, by the way. None of these people are real. And these people here under my thumb are one of the races, and the second race is down the bottom. In this first race, this is not in fact the legal ballot order. So on the actual paper ballots, we wouldn't expect to see Martin Foley at the top. Someone arriving after me at the polling station will be printed one of these as well. But this order will be different again. And in fact, this shuffle here, this shuffled order, is a secret. It's a secret known only to this device here, which is about to forget it. It will erase its record. It's known to me because I have this sheet here. And at the end of the election, the end of polling, in this polling booth, I'm going to shred this. So in fact, this secret order here that you see will be hidden, obscured. Okay, so I'm then guided over to the voting machine, or I walk over to the voting machine and I lay down my slip over here under the scanner. The voting machine goes off and makes a server request to check that this ballot hasn't been voted, and then it lets me in. So over here in the voting booth, this is a privacy booth with earphones. I'd normally be wearing those if I were an elector because at least the first few instructions are in language, and for people with low vision, I would then take the earphones off if I could continue on, purely based on the screen image. There's a printer here which is going to print me a receipt, and here's the screen. So once more, even though I chose English, perhaps I was wrong and I wanted Arabic, in which case I would scroll down and
speaking my language of Arabic. Instead, I'll stick with English. Again, my choices in terms of vision impairment are shown. If I get this far and I get stuck here because I can't see any of these choices, I would probably call a staff member over who would switch me to audio-only voting. If I get this far, it probably means I can see the screen, and so I'm shown an animation, and this little animation, together with this text here, and also with spoken instructions through the earphones, gives three media, of which I would hope to understand one and understand what to do. And it's pretty clear here from the cartoon that I'm to touch the ballot. And in Victoria, you have to touch every square in your order of preference, starting with your most preferred candidate. So, all right, I get it. And here is the ballot. So it's quite a long ballot. And as is often the case with e-voting, some of the candidates are obscured. So we have these devices to highlight the fact that part of it's obscured. And I just vote by touching the screen as shown in the video. Let's say I miss a few because I didn't get that there was some early screen. If I hit next, I get a message saying you have to number them all, and so I go back here. Right, so when I do this, okay, let's do a few. Looks like I got the lot. Okay, so when I go next, all's well, and I move on to the second race. Now the second race has two modes of voting. A kind of a simplified list voting, where I simply pick a group and I'm done, a group or political party. But it has a more complex mode where I can actually vote for the candidates within the group. So in this case, if I choose to vote for a group, which is what 95% of electors do, my task is only to sort of review the group memberships and then pick one of these groups. So I've chosen Australian Christians. If instead I wanted to number the people below the line, so let's say I liked a couple of the Australian Christians but not all of them, instead I would press and hold here and switch to below line voting. Now you see I can number the boxes below the line. So I like these two guys, but I don't like the middle guy, so I move over to the Labor Party and I choose the remaining 5 I have to pick. I can actually number them all, it could be up to 40, but I only need to pick 5. Okay, next. So there's my votes. The lower house votes you saw me make first, and then the upper house votes on the right. And I voted for candidates. Okay, so I press next. It says here this is the end of the line. Any changes cannot be made after I click send my votes. So I click send my votes. The system sends the vote off to the server, and it prints me out a receipt. Now, what you'll notice here is that this is not the order. This is not the order that I voted in. Okay, I didn't put the 11th guy at the top. But when I combine this with my candidate list, which was printed for me before, just doing this one-handed, a bit of a struggle. Okay, so when I combine these two together, it's actually like a kind of a cheat sheet or a code sheet. And I can actually see here that Stephen Albany did get my first preference, and I can see here that Adam Albanese got my second preference. Okay, so even though this shuffled order is not what I saw on the screen, it does actually show me that that's the way I voted. And what's interesting here is that it is this receipt at the back that has been sent to the central server. Okay? And this shuffled order has actually been encrypted and is a secret. So if I leave the polling station just with this, there's actually nothing on this receipt that could tell anybody how I voted. And this list, as I said before, actually is retained by the polling station and securely destroyed. So over here on my right is the candidate list box, and I get rid of this by jamming it in here, and it's periodically, the box is periodically replaced and resealed, and everything in it is shredded.
We had shredders.
So I can take this home now, and in fact I can look up this serial number here. So it's a little bit blurry, but you can see that there's a serial number which is 515-0101, column 124. I can look that up at home, and I should see this entire receipt. And in fact, the VEC only has this data, but the VEC retains the ability to decrypt this receipt, effectively decrypting the shuffle. The shuffle lets this receipt be reordered back into the legal ballot order, and then this can be counted.
All right, it must be close to 40 minutes, sure. I'll just say a bit more about the deployment. So the electors, we actually fully evaluated this system, which means that we ran surveys in Victoria and we ran randomly selected surveys in London. And we also surveyed the staff extensively. And there's a publication coming up in IEEE Security and Privacy with all these results. And you can get that off our website at the end. Generally speaking, the electors found the system acceptable, including the fact that they also had to handle this new receipt. Okay, so this was something we were very worried about, that they'd either revolt or that they would become confused. They'd wonder why the receipt showed their vote being different to how they cast it. This didn't eventuate. As I said, the Victorian sites took very few votes because actually there are very few people who vote before the election who have disabilities, unfortunately. But in London, we took a lot of votes. And by a lot, I mean sort of 900. Unfortunately, there were setup problems at the beginning, at almost every location. So when our staff got this stuff out of the boxes and plugged it together, there were problems. But part of those were due to a general network problem at the Electoral Commission, because the Electoral Commission was deploying other services at the same time that were new. So a bit risky. Suffice to say that all these technical problems were sorted out within the first day or so of 2 weeks of voting. I mentioned before that you can cancel a vote, so if you use our system and you get all the way through and you actually vote, but you didn't intend to, you just kept pressing OK because the system said to, in fact, you didn't like it at all, or in fact if your receipt comes out wrong. So if the receipt comes out and you do the comparison and it's incorrect, you can cancel the vote, and there's a protocol for that. And actually 6 votes were cancelled, okay? And there was another protocol for omitting votes from the decrypt, which was a public protocol. In total, we took 2,242 votes. Okay? They were printed out and they were included with the postal votes of the election. Because the rest of the election was paper, 3.2 million votes, we had to print out on paper and it had to be counted on paper because it's a manual election. Obviously, if a very large number of people was using the e-voting system, you might key in the residual paper votes. And yes, there were about 100 people who looked up their receipts. We think it was more, but we're sure of about 100 people who looked their receipts up. And there were downloads of all the commit files. Everything that we emitted was downloaded by people out on the internet. I'll just skip forward. Okay, so this is almost the end of my presentation. Today, I've heard people talking about what kind of cryptography we'll use, what qualities the software will have, what kind of software will it be? Will it do this kind of hashing? Will it do that? All these specific technical issues. But what we really want, what we really want is a system that's independent of the software. So we don't actually care what software is running the election, provided that the verification system is there. So for example, someone might break into the central server and install a special version of Angry Birds. Okay, Angry Birds, the game. They might install it on our election server. As long as that version of Angry Birds sticks to the election protocol, you can have integrity in the election, believe it or not. The risk for a hack of that size is a privacy risk because the votes can be possibly linked to their voter, but you can't break integrity in this system with anything without there being some kind of emitted proof due to the laws of physics. Okay, and so there's a couple of exceptions to this, which I'll have to admit to you. All the software was written by the VEC and housed at the VEC, and you might think that's a good thing, okay, keep control of it, but actually what we really want in the future is that different organisations come forward, electoral parties, independent observers, and they actually furnish components of the software, would you believe? And as I said, it doesn't even matter if it's Angry Birds. We hope it isn't. But as long as it sticks to the protocol, you have a healthier system if all the components are written separately and housed separately, and they talk to each other. So that's a very challenging concept. I couldn't get that across in 2014. A verifying tool, we had to write that because there wasn't one. Ideally, if you're verifying our election, you use a tool that's available on the internet. There isn't one there yet. And we provided ballot audits to electors. Possibly the biggest problem in our deployment was that these ballot audits were not used. As I've said before, the future is for the group called Coasca, which is a commercial company, to try and encourage people to build and use independent versions of this system. And as I've said, to use what I call heterogeneous implementations, different implementations written by different experts. And really, we want the people who take part in the election to be mutually distrusting. So what I said before about elections in the olden days, the Australian ballot allowed mutually distrusting people to stand around, look at the election process and look at each other and satisfy themselves that nobody had intervened. This is a core requirement of election systems. And this is where we want to go. I'm going to skip over this because I'm out of time. Okay? That's my final slide. Any questions?